Hello everybody, it's Jade. This week we have a double stuffed episode because due to the contents of this section, I ended up accidentally reading about twice as much as I usually do. So this week we're covering chapters 9.1 through 10.7. I was finally able to convince myself to stop when I got to interlude 10.x because I realized that I wouldn't really be able to make an effective episode if I covered like 16 chapters a week. Additionally, this episode should be coming out on a Saturday for you. Saturday will be the new day that these come out. I'm just moving it around because of life stuff, so look forward to that. You have to wait one less day overall. At the beginning of 9.1, our mysterious protagonist wakes up. And up until this point, there has been some suspicion that the protagonist could be someone else, someone who isn't Blake, someone with different habits and character traits. But when the protagonist wakes up and he's missing an eye, or rather he's lost the use of one eye, and he's super injured and just continues to push on anyway and is really in a tough spot, you know that it really can't be anybody else. And eventually Blake does confirm that it's him. He says that he's Blake, but a few sentences in, you're like, no one else is this self-destructive, or at least so blasé about the destruction of their own self. So yeah, take that, everybody who was complaining that they didn't want to have to read from Rose's perspective. So this is the beginning of a full arc, or almost a full arc, where Blake is walking around the drains, which is this world of psychological horror and bleakness. Blake can barely see at any given time because it's just so dark. The people who live there are in worse squalor than anything he ever experienced when he was homeless. People are either waiting to be eaten or in the process of eating other people. If you want to be able to survive without eating other people, you have to give up portions of yourself and your humanity until it effectively makes no difference who you were at the beginning of your life. Yeah, it's just so horrible that you're pretty much just waiting and hoping for Blake to get out, as if getting out and going back to the real world would be better, which is what I was hoping before he did. Yeah, it mostly just sucks. But Blake does meet a few people in the drains who don't suck. They especially don't suck in comparison to some of the other people we've met so far in the story, like Laird and Duncan. And the first person that he meets down here is a little mermaid named Green Eyes. And I want to talk about shipping for a second. So I've been working on this like grand unified shipping theory up to this point that I was hoping to present in some episode. You may remember a few weeks ago I talked about the way that Wildbow builds hype for two people meeting, which is that usually he will give someone an interlude and then introduce them to the protagonist, so that when the protagonist and the person with the interlude meet up, you're excited to see these two people that you already know and like come together. And I had a theory that for people to be invested in a relationship between two people, that this was almost necessary. You have to already like a potential match for Blake before it becomes clear that they are a potential match for Blake. But 9.1 just goes ahead and dashes that theory into the ground. It just takes that theory and slaughters it. Because from about the third or fourth line that Green Eyes speaks, I was all aboard, right? She's just incredibly charming, and other than the fact that Blake is so put off by Green Eyes and her need to eat people and request to eat his corpse, she's really adorable, and I'm excited that she is continuing to be in this story. Somehow she's just incredibly charming. So Blake leaves his meeting with Green Eyes, and he meets a bunch of the other humans and former humans who are living in the drains, people who are in the process of becoming the kind of creature that Midge was. And it really adds an amount of terror to the kind of terror that we've described previously. Before, I said that it's really horrifying to know that what someone expects of you can shape the way you think. You know, if people think that you're evil, even if you have good intentions, as an other, you can become evil just because that's what people think you are. The drains add an extra layer to that. I'm not sure if it means that it's like this in every case, or just in some cases, but the people of the drains are making the choice to trade away the qualities that they like about themselves. The parts that are more stable, the parts that make them identifiable to themselves. It really adds a level of horror that you can't even apply the label of victim as strongly when it's the person trading away their own traits. It's clear that these people still are victims, but they're being forced to do these things to themselves. It takes away the ability to even pity yourself or feel like you were robbed. So in 9.2, Blake has this dream. And in this dream, he is this bat falcon Groot creature that roams the drains looking for a way out, but never quite making it there. He has basically become an unrecognizable version of himself. Every quality that we have gotten to know about Blake, his slowness to anger, his connection to his friends, his desire to, his habit of never seeing others as less than human, or at least trying not to. They're all completely gone. Also, his inability to be touched by others is also completely gone. We see that he has this idea of something like romance with the way that he's always staring after Alexis. The fact that he's interested in having coffee with Tiffany and continuing to hang out with her, despite the fact that he knows that they probably couldn't have a physical relationship. And in this dream, he has a purely physical relationship with Green Eyes, despite the fact that he has no romantic feelings for her at all. It comes across as someone who is completely different from the Blake that we've known. The only recognizable feature about him is the branches that have started to grow from his arms and the fact that he has feathers. And it's just really quite horrifying. And the first time I read this, I accidentally missed the last line where he says that he can't speak anymore. And so I took this time skip at face value. Like, I thought that this was actually what was happening. And coincidentally, as I was reading this, one of my family members offered me a piece of cheesecake. So I got up, I ate the cheesecake, and I was really disturbed. I kept thinking to myself, like, I don't want to read this, man. Like, Blake has gone back to being homeless. He's back to exactly where he was several years before the start of the story, except he's worse. I don't want to read about this new person who has nothing in common with the protagonist that I've grown to love. And I was just sitting there eating my cheesecake, like, and one of my family members said, "Jade, what is wrong?" And I described what had just happened. I was like, in this book that I was reading, you know, the protagonist has gone back to being homeless, and even though he always got into bad situations, he always found a way to get out, and he never really lost his sense of goodness, you know, not completely. And my family said, "Wow, this book sounds terrible. Maybe you should stop reading it." And I didn't want to stop reading it, but after that, I had to edit last week's video, which took me a couple of hours. So it was about 4 hours between the time that I started reading the dream and the time that I read the sentence, and then I woke up. So I just about cried. I really did not want to read the rest of this book if we started from the point where Blake is in the dream. Or if we started at a new point there. So even though we're definitely supposed to glean from this qualities that Blake will be displaying in the future, and he certainly does display some of these qualities in the future, But I'm really glad that that was a fake out. Really freaked me out. So then in 9.4, I called this chapter, "These are the things that little Blakes are made of." So 9.4 gives us a look back on Blake's life, following a bunch of things that that happened to him or happened to him that defined who he is. It shows how he came into contact with the man who ultimately raped him, but also how he joined this convent that this man was starting, how he met Alexis, how he turned away from someone who was offering him help. Just a bunch of what the characters in Inside Out would call core memories. And Blake is forced to relive all of them and recite each line word for word, just like that one part in the Ready Player One book. So after a few months of doing this, Blake realizes that what these scenes are trying to show him is not anything about any of these dreams in particular, but the fact that none of them ever really happened. They are all memories that were manufactured based on a simulation. Blake's life started in chapter 1.1. He has been the vestige all along. And I want to talk about this plot twist. So last week I went on this long talk about vestiges and robots, and how I empathize with the kind of character that other characters doubt their validity as sentient beings. And I said that this kind of character influenced me to choose a career in robotics. But it's not so much that I watched enough WALL-E or enough Star Wars that eventually one day I decided to get into robots. It was this book. It's called Hive. It was just one of those books that had the exact set of elements and the exact tone that hit me at just the correct way at a specific time in my life. So it was about this kid named Otto. And this kid was a little shit, right? Like, he had no redeeming qualities personality-wise. He was kind of a jerk, didn't care about anybody. But nobody really cared about this fact because he was exceptionally smart and exceptionally good at everything. So it turned out that Otto was specifically engineered and grown in a cloning vat to be a donor body for an artificial intelligence that wanted to be able to live as a human. So he came pre-programmed with all of these skills and abilities that he didn't actually develop himself. And this plot twist was incredible to me because it turned out that to Otto, everything that he valued about himself, everything that he thought made him special, was a lie. And not only a lie, but a lie designed to pacify him into thinking that he didn't need to make any other connections, to make him believe that he was safe, when in fact he was just created so that one day he could conveniently die for someone else. So from that point on, he's left to face that he has nothing to define him that is really worth someone defining themselves by. And he's forced to redefine himself through making connections with other people and actually trying to do the right thing instead of being a little shit. But this is a story that I have thought about a lot, and I want you to understand that this kind of character, the unchosen one, for whatever reason, just appeals to me. Blake's entire existence is built around him serving a single purpose, while being under the impression that he is chosen to do something extraordinary, when in reality, he is, at the end of this story, supposed to die. And I imagine at this point that the situation that Blake is currently in, being in the drains, is where Granny Rose expected him to just stay. You know, something like this would happen to him eventually, and he would just stay down here, and then he doesn't really care what he does after that. But the thing that this does to Blake, when he discovers that he's really only been alive for about 2 weeks, is it completely devastates any information that he has about himself. Every single quality that he has been decided by someone else for what would be most convenient to Rose, either of them. And when you're left in that situation, what possible way of defining yourself do you have? So I think that the answer to this is the choices that you have actually made since being actually alive, and especially embracing the changes that have occurred because of those choices that you made. But I feel like we're going to be talking about that a lot more, so let's move on. After this, Blake goes back to talk to the witch, and he sees that the birds on his arms have sort of become alive, and they're kind of peeking their heads out. And maybe not all of these spirits are great, but he keeps covering them up with his sleeves, like he's embarrassed or something, or he wants to shush them. Come on, man. They're little birds. Like, be nice. Okay, so I want to talk about how the revelation that Blake was a vestige impacted the world. I really, really hope that we get more information about how Granny Rose was able to pull this off, because my mind is completely bent. Originally, when there was the explanation that Rose was the manufactured one, and that her entire life was a simulation, and that eventually she could be given a body, but everything that she owned, all of the things that she interacted with, was just a simulation, that made perfect sense to me. Got it. The idea that Blake was a simulation all along, to me, takes a lot more magic and is a lot more mind-bending. For example, where did Blake's motorcycle come from? How did they decide that Alexis was the person that he was going to emulate? Was she just... Did they search for the nicest person in a 50-mile radius who met a certain criteria, such as age? I don't know. It's not like practitioners have like a Google with advanced search. And then the people around Blake behave as if he has been the person alive the entire time. So Paige, for example, is significantly bitchier in Rose's timeline than in Blake's. And we've mostly talked about Paige from the standpoint of Rose's timeline, but she's been acting like the Paige in Blake's timeline as far as we've known her. So now that Blake is dead, did she go back to acting like the bitchier version from Rose's timeline? I don't know. Does this bother Isadora because she's acting like a different person now? I don't know. Did Granny Rose go to apartments.com and then find an apartment that Blake could be in that was close to people that she deemed appropriate to influence him? I don't know. And maybe we won't get that fine a detail, but I need to understand how she did this. I get that the barber is able to cut out a reflection, and I understand that Rose was shoved into the reflection. But if she tailor-made Blake down to specific details of his personality, I want to know how she achieved each of those things. Or at least broadly how she did it. Additionally, if she tailor-made parts of his personality, such as having been physically violated so he won't touch things, so he won't get damaged because he's a vestige, why didn't she give him a module that would make him love Rose and be able to get along with Rose? Because after this, he seriously considers murdering her, and I feel like that would be against Granny Rose's design. I want to know. This is kind of obvious, but the changes that have occurred in Blake since his creation, like deviating from Granny Rose's plan, are Tiffany. So he met Tiffany, he met Evan, and then the creation of the Cabal, and then how each of the Cabal members behaves after they awaken. He knows Mags, who is someone who Granny Rose probably didn't rely too much on, since she had only been in Jacob's Bell for 2 months before she died. Green Eyes, and then the decisions that Rose didn't approve of are probably the biggest ones to look at. And then Evan being, we already mentioned Evan, but Evan being the biggest influence on Blake's behavior that was not up to Granny Rose's design. Thinking about this actually sent me down a rabbit hole of thinking about whether Rose knew about this, because Rose was really, really opposed to a few of Blake's major decisions, but 2 of them were taking on Evan as a familiar and the creation of the Cabal. But she wanted him to take and implement. And the question of whether Rose knew that he was a vestige brings up, is it possible that she didn't want these other actual people to become members of the party because she knew that she would be responsible for him once he died? it's easy to envision a situation in which she wants Blake to take an implement because if he dies, it's just an object that she can throw away. But if he takes an 8-year-old to be his familiar and then he dies, then she's stuck with some kid, right? And now we'll never know what Rose 2 was thinking, and we're stuck with Rose 3, who I thought was going to be better. And she's not. So the witch told Blake that he would lose whatever he faced when he faced Carl. And he faced his past. But it turned out that he faced his entire past up until the last couple of weeks. So I'll talk a little bit more about Jeremy later, but the thing that I want to say about his interlude is that it's interesting that Dionysus is a deity that so much wants material things and actions and gives material things in return. Other classical gods want faith. They want something emotional. They want actions and prayer that show fealty. Dionysus appears to want stuff to get done. He wants Nathan to give these teenagers some alcohol. He wants concrete things. It's interesting. I want to see another deity in this world, other than the faceless god that we totally skipped over. So with seeing Blake down in the drains and how humans become others, I'm really starting to keep an eye out for how humans fit into the overall scheme of things. It's almost starting to bother me that humans are considered separate than others. It seems like they should just be considered their own species, right? It's almost like saying there's one particular race of humans and then everybody else is just other, right? If you say the white people and the brown people, you sound like an asshole. So why is it that humans are considered to be one thing and everybody else is lumped into a separate group? It seems like maybe the Seal of Solomon is what's actually separating humans from everybody else. But I'm wondering if either A, there's more to it, or B, humans just think they're special. And there's actually nothing particularly special about humans. Really struggling to not put on a tinfoil hat here. So the scene with Blake going to go talk to the rest of the sad sacks in the Hillsglade house, really, there's a whole lot to talk about there, and it really pissed me off and all that stuff. But I'm actually going to talk about most of that stuff later, so I'm going to skip right over it for now. So after Blake is banished from Hillsglade house, and before, but especially after, it becomes clear that he's really losing his grip on who he used to be. And there are a whole lot of reasons why he's losing his grip on who he used to be. But the fact that he no longer has bodily processes really sells it. And is really making the situation worse. So there's this recurring theme in Wildbow's works of people's emotions being tied to their bodily processes. And this is really interesting because when I did a lot more writing, a piece of advice that I saw and that I've tended to use is that if you want a reader to feel the same emotion as your protagonist, you need to describe not the way that they feel, but their bodily processes as they are feeling those emotions. My heart rate went up, or it was difficult to meet this person's eyes, or I felt a sick feeling in my gut, and then describe what they're feeling. It helps the reader really connect with what the narrator is expressing. But Wildbow takes that an additional step by saying that if a person doesn't have these things, then they don't feel that emotion as easily or as intensely, or perhaps even at all. So Blake here, without his emotions that makes him feel things like sympathy, he really starts to act far more monstrous. All of these things being a symptom of him being in the mirror and thus not having any bodily functions, which really does start to cast a lot of the previous Rose's actions into an interesting light, her attitude specifically. Blake starts behaving very, very differently because of what's going on to his body, and I want to talk about this for a minute. So I wouldn't say most, a lot of people can relate to the idea that your emotions are doing something that you don't want them to, and causing you to behave in a way that you normally wouldn't. For example, pregnant women, people on any kind of hormonal therapy, people who are taking any kind of medication for another kind of condition that affects their emotions in a way that may be unintentional, and then people with brain tumors or other mind-altering conditions. All of these people, their emotions start to make them behave in a way that they normally wouldn't. And when you're on a medication like this, or having this kind of condition, the most important thing that you need to do is sit down at a time when you're not compromised and say, all right, what are some rules for myself that I'm going to follow to make sure that I don't become a slave to this situation? I don't start doing things that otherwise I would regret. Like a pregnant person might say, all right, I know that this is going to make me feel angry more often, but I'm going to make a deal with myself that I'm never going to hit anyone, or I'm never going to throw anything. And you have to decide those things independently of being in a situation. Blake doesn't do that. I really hope that at the end of this section, when he is forced to have a timeout with himself, that he does. Not that I think that it's going to be the first priority on his mind, but it's really an essential step when you're having to deal with this kind of situation. Something that Blake hasn't had to deal with before, because he's never had to deal with anything before because he's 3 weeks old. So something that Blake says at one point is, I hadn't really escaped at all. I was only serving the ends of the drains in this space. So a couple weeks ago I said that it is Rose who is always only the pawn of her parents, the pawn of Granny Rose. It is Blake now who is just acting at the behest of what something else wants. It's really sad. So Faysal asks him something. If you grow ever uglier, then what will you do when there is nothing uglier than you that you're able to fight? I'll have reached the end of my short, violent road, I suppose, I said. This is horrifying. This is a commitment to trying to fight rather than trying to live. When Blake lost his connections, the thing that he had left was his will to live. And now he doesn't have that either. He just wants to fight. And it reminds you of the dream. The dream where he was killing things that were eviler than him as he became eviler and eviler. I'm really glad that Faysal was able to help him in some way, but he really needs another solution or he's going to turn into a monster. And I do think that by the end of this he's going to turn into a monster. I just want him to not be a monster permanently. So Blake can travel a lot more places than Rose could when she was in the mirror. I have a couple theories for this. One, she's been in Jacob's Bell for a month, so she's traveled more places in Jacob's Bell. But two, Blake wasn't really alive, so I don't think she could travel to the places that he could only remember having been to. Maybe it's a combination of both. So, skipping ahead, Mags considers taking Molly as a familiar. Interestingly, I had just written down that I was wondering if Mags would ask Blake to be her familiar, which I really didn't want to happen because I'm holding out hope for Blake to figure out something with Evan. But I'm not sure how I feel about the idea of Mags taking Molly as a familiar. I do really, I don't think it's particularly a bad idea. I do like Mags a lot, and I can see myself liking Molly in the future. But this basically means that Mags will be doing penance for what she did to Molly for the rest of her life. And to some people, that's a good thing, but Mags was or Maggie at the time was, like 16 years old, 17, and she was tricked into doing something by Laird. And yeah, Laird is dead. But I'm not in love with the idea that Mags has to continue to pay penance for something that she was manipulated into doing for the rest of her life. Now, she's not entirely innocent. She did actually do it. And Molly is dead. But I hope they're able to work out an arrangement that's not so problematic for them, 30 years from now. On the other hand, Mags is at risk for falling through the cracks, and she doesn't have her implement anymore. So, getting a familiar at all is good for her. So Blake is sitting by himself, and Faysal comes up to him, and Blake is like, "What's up, dog?" And then Blake is able to talk to Faysal for a little while about the nature of humanity and stuff, and it helps Blake to sort of reconnect with what it's like to be a reasonable human, which, by the way, he was really also able to do when Mags was around. And then Faysal summons Green Eyes, which is super neat. Blake hasn't really been able to hang out with his actual, I almost said actual friends, but with his fake friends. So it's cool that he has a real friend around that other than Mags that he can talk to. So at one point they're chasing down Molly, and Blake says, "The back of Hillsglade House, where the hills and the glades mingled. I'd met her in Bound June here, and traveling a little farther, I'd negotiated somewhat unsuccessfully with the Briar Girl." So that brings up, so as Blake is hanging around Mags, as I said, he's reconnecting with what it's like to be himself, with what it's like to be human, with what it's like to not be the bat, falcon, Groot creature from his dream. But on top of connecting with who he actually was, he's also experiencing a lot of the things that he only remembers experiencing previously, such as he actually got to be homeless for a little while in the drains. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but he's now actually experienced it instead of just remembering it. And then he apparently has never actually met his family, but now he has gotten to meet some of the other Thorburns or see them. So I wonder if this is going to continue. I wonder if he's going to continue to experience things that he didn't actually experience but only remembered. And I wonder if this will make him more of a person. I don't know. It's interesting. And then after that, he even sort of gets Evan back for a little while. And Blake really starts to act like the way he has always acted. Yeah, he's in the mirror and all that stuff, but he's really reconnected with the person that he's been the whole time. But then Rose just fucks it up. So I want to talk about some of the story movements overall in this arc. I understand that the order that I've been going in has been kind of crazy, but whatever. So at this point in the story, it seems like something unspeakably horrible has happened to Blake, obviously, but it reminds you of a person with a very lucrative or visible career, but the kind of career where even one screw up can really destroy you. Let's say you are a politician or other public figure who did something unsavory at some point, and now you have to resign, you have to stop doing what you're doing, because people don't see you the same way anymore. You have to find a new way to make money. You have to find a new way to secure a future for your family. And maybe you can have a happy life again, but it'll never be the life that you had. That's really what this arc feels like. But the reason this hurts so much is because he's made so much progress in the story. He started out at 0, and then he became a better and better practitioner. But now he has no ability to practice. He's lost his ability to see connections. He can't do any particular magic other than bleeding, which not great, especially because he can't heal anymore. All of the gains that he's made are lost completely. It doesn't feel like he's going back to step 0. It feels like he's gone back to step -15. The only thing he has that he didn't have before the start of the series is the fact that he's alive. And that's basically it. Because of the major paradigm shifts that we got in this section, I went back and re-listened to a bunch of the recent episodes that I did. And in particular, I listened to the way that I talked about Blake finding Evan. And it feels just so triumphant in those 2 arcs. It feels like he has gained something concrete and good. And now that he doesn't have Evan anymore, it feels like Blake has lost the most important thing that he's gained in the story. And on top of that, he lost what I liked so much about Blake in that section where he gained Evan, which was that he became a better person. I feel now that we have something like that version of Blake that we saw in the dream. It is still the same character, but it hurts to see that the person that I liked so much isn't around at the moment. But while that is done extremely well, I do have a little bit of a complaint. And maybe this complaint will go away depending on what happens in the next arc. But it's been a while since I've had anything to complain about this book, but I feel like I need to say this one. I don't feel like I have a good finger on the motivations of Ty, Tiff, and Alexis. They act like consistent characters. Everything that they say is consistent with what we know about them. And they're not acting off. But I don't feel like they have any agency. They almost feel like they are just Rose's goons. I don't feel like they're making decisions, and they largely just go along with everything that she says. This is especially frustrating in the case of Alexis, because she's such a strong and important character to the themes of this story. And she has looked at Blake with feelings of conflict a bunch, and that's neat. But I hope one or all of them makes a decision soon to do something outside of Rose's influence, because it feels like they're just following her because they are. I do like the fact that by the end of this, Blake definitely feels like he's back to being himself largely, especially the point when he prays to the spirits to take away Evan's poison. It sucks that right as he went back to being the person that I wanted to read about, he got bound. So something that we learn in this section is that Molly knew that she was going to die. So Rose has said two things about what she knew so far, which was that Molly was appointed the heir and that she was appointed the heir. And these things seemed like they were conflicting information, but in hindsight, they actually aren't. What it turns out is Molly was told that she was going to inherit the house, but that her death was planned for, and that Rose was the actual intended heir. So it doesn't seem like Rose actually lied about that, interestingly. But man, doesn't it suck to be Molly? Granny Rose sacrificed not one, but two people to get Rose into the position of third heir, so that, 3 is the magic number. She sacrificed a living grandchild in Molly, and then created an additional grandchild to sacrifice in Blake, which just sucks. I wish I could talk more about Green Eyes, but I'm mostly worried about Evan, so yeah, that's where my concerns lie at the moment. Speaking of which, let's talk about Evan. So it's really obvious that a bunch of Blake's situation mirrors Mags's, loss of self, etc., etc. But Evan's situation also mirrors Blake's, but it seems to be more enforced. And not even mirror, but it's more like he's in just as shitty a situation. We find out that he's effectively dying. His feathers are falling out. He looks ill all the time. The others are giving him blood, but it's just kind of delaying the inevitable. He's been manipulated by the group. Now he's drugged. He has no agency. He's dying, and he's pretty much being held hostage at this point. The group is hanging on to him largely because they know that Blake wants him. And that just fucking sucks. Also in relation to Blake, he's easily just kind of sucking in whatever spirits are around because his connection with Blake has been lost. And now his feathers are turning black because Blake gave him some of his blood, and Blake is tainted by the drains. Really just all around a horrible situation for Evan. But Faysal says that Blake's connections are repairing, or at least some of them. So I'm thinking that there's basically 3 kinds of connections that Blake has, and maybe 1 or 2 of them might be repairing. So there's magical, so stuff that is connections that Blake has that were created in a magical way. The major ones being Rose and Evan. And then next would be the manufactured connections. So the connections that Granny Rose decided would be convenient for Blake to have. People like Alexis and Ty. And then mundane connections. So people that Blake met since he was born but that he has no particular magical connection to, people like Mags and Green Eyes. But in the case of both Mags and Green Eyes, they remember him, so they're fine. Tiff also falls into this category, but I'm not actually sure he's going to regain that connection. I think that the connections between Blake and both Rose and Evan would probably be mended, especially because Blake is pouring blood into the connection with Evan, and it seems to go somewhere. I really wish that Blake could still see connections, because that would be that would make this a whole lot less confusing. I feel like that is definitely a way that this is being kept from us. I really admire Alexis's ability to be empathetic in this situation, because imagine somebody comes up to you and they say, hey, I'm a clone or some other manufactured creature, and I was designed to be in love with you, but in these memories, you do not love me back. Anyway, let's be best friends. Most people would run away screaming, but she's like, man, I really feel for you. I'm conflicted here. At the same time, I still hope Alexis does something at some point. So now I want to talk about Rose. I'm really mad at Rose. I've been defending Rose, but now that I have been making so many excuses for her, the point when I stopped being able to make excuses for her, she just pissed me off. I want to start with the fact that when she first met Blake's friends, she talked about how much she wished that she had friends, and she had never really been able to make friends. And I was hoping that she would be able to forge some kind of friendship with somebody. Alexis would be one option, Maggie another. But when Blake leaves the picture and she has a month to spend with the Cabal, just kind of hanging out, she chooses to instead spend her time summoning demons. She had the opportunity to choose happiness and warmth, even a little bit, and she doesn't. And it makes me sad and disappointed. But the point when she became dead to me, and dead in the way that can come back in this world, but dead to me, is the point when he is talking to her about, it's the point when Blake is talking to the Cabal about who he is and all that stuff. And he tries to ask Evan what he thinks, and Rose says, no, Evan's impressionable and he's weak right now. And he says, Evan is stronger than that. So Rose says, Duncan Behane could theoretically walk in here and talk to Evan, and win Evan over with talk of flaming sparrows and video games. Evan's too trusting, and hasn't been burned enough times to know to stay away from the fire. Now, on a reread, this doesn't sound as bad, but her absolute dismissal of Evan's agency and opinion just really doesn't sit well with me. I hate it. She doesn't take other people's opinions into account, anyone's, Evan's included. But this is the point when when it just became clear that she's not interested in what other people have to say. She doesn't think of other people as people. She's really starting to remind me of Rose Senior, and I know we're supposed to get that. I know. It doesn't make me happy. And then after this, she figures out that Blake is telling the truth and that Evan was Blake's familiar all along. And instead of saying, you know what, I'm going to try to do a nice thing, she uses Evan to capture Blake and bind him. It pissed me off so bad. I wrote a little bullshit translated version of this. It says, this child I am taking care of is dying. I've met this man who may be able to help him. So I will use the child to capture the man because I am convinced that the man genuinely cares for the child. I'm not sure how true this is, again, but recontextualizing the book based on the idea that Rose knew that Blake would die, it makes it look like so many of her decisions were her just trying to make sure that Blake didn't set up anything that would be inconvenient for her. I don't like the fact that she set up a dead man switch with a barber. It feels like she's throwing something like a tantrum. But we'll see. I'm really starting to see her almost as a Johannes character. The kind of character who sees other people as pawns, and doesn't care if people who aren't human die. And eventually will stop caring whether people who are human die. Now, I do like the idea that both Blake and Rose were potentially vestiges. Or somehow Rose was tweaked, because if Granny Rose was willing to sacrifice Molly and used presumably a huge amount of magic to create Blake, why wouldn't she tweak Rose to make the perfect heir? Is she really willing to do all of this for Rose to be just the way she was? I don't know. Hopefully we'll either see that Rose has some incredible quality that makes us understand why Granny Rose would choose her specifically, or we will find out that there is something about her that otherwise makes her perfect. So, lastly, I want to do a little bit of a review of The Barber. When I first started reading this book, I wasn't sure. I didn't actually know that I was going to be covering it, so I didn't pay extra attention during 1.7 when they were going over what The Barber is. So, I just want to kind of give you guys a recap, because I gave myself a recap. So, for one, anything his image exists in, he exists in, including a reflection. So he can exist in multiple places. If you see him, he exists within your eyes, and he exists wherever else he exists, as far as I can tell. He perceives time differently, and he considers speaking with all Thorburns to be a single entity. He doesn't speak and uses only gestures. That means that you have to gesture to him to communicate, but you also can't look at him while you're doing it. He smells like blood, rot, or burning hair, and he appears to the unawakened as a cutting instrument of some kind. He usually maims his victims and then repairs them to the point that they end up dying of starvation or exposure. He can remove practitioner abilities. Obviously, he can carve out someone's reflection. He can bar people's access to the afterlife, something that's been brought up a few times. He's very suited to getting around practitioner defenses, but not suited particularly to fighting innocents, other than just cutting them. Something that I wanted to pull out is it says he will offer to extend a practitioner's natural lifespan by half again or by 25 years, whichever is less, at the cost of the practitioner forever smelling blood, rot, and or burning hair. What's interesting is Rose Sr. did not take this deal. She ended up dealing with Aemon Behaim for an extended lifespan instead. So, just pointing that out. So yeah, we're running way over, so I wanted to go just do an update on the ship rankings this week. This is not exhaustive, but this week's theme is how much I want two people to be together, not necessarily how much I enjoyed their interactions this week. These are not necessarily romantic, and in some cases, they don't fit the theme. So, rank 1, Blake and Evan. I feel like last time I said that I wasn't always going to mention them because their dynamic would probably remain the same. I feel like I cursed this, and then retroactively that caused the story to change, which we can see is what happened when Blake was erased. So I'm sorry, but I want them to get back to having some amount of teamwork, as close to what they previously had as possible. Thank you. Number 2, Sandra and Jeremy. This is so frustrating because it seemed to me that in Sandra's interlude, the reason why their marriage wasn't always working out was because she didn't feel like, or one of the many reasons, was because she didn't feel like he loved her or could love her because he had all these nymphs around and stuff. When it's clear reading Jeremy's interlude that he always did love her. Come on, Jeremy, just tell your wife you love her. 3, Blake and Green Eyes. I can't even see this. I'm reading it, and I can tell she's cute as a button. And Blake needs to recognize this. Number 4, Blake and Mags. Not romantic, but Blake behaves markedly less like a crazy person when she's around, and hanging around her definitely made him better. So yeah. Number 5, Maggie and Molly. This is where we're starting to get a little bit iffy. I really hope they are able to work this out, though, in a way that's mutually beneficial. Number 6, the abstract demon and Sunlight. Really want those two to get together. Number 7, Rose and the Cabal. I really hope that, and this is where I'm sarcastic. I want the Cabal to leave Rose. I don't feel like I don't feel like it's good for them, and I don't feel like what Rose is doing is good for anybody. Number 8, Blake and Rose. Always at the bottom, these two. And then only people lower than Blake and Rose are Blake and that one other dude who wanted to go hunting for people. I definitely don't want him hanging out with that guy. So yeah, that's ship rankings for this week. Because Blake has been captured in the mirror in front of the library, I think it would be really funny if the next arc was just a bunch of interludes that are textbook excerpts. Now that would probably get annoying, but it would be funny. Alright guys, see you in the next one.